Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-sprint reaction for the Azerbaijan or Baku race. This is the post-sprint reaction, not the GP, as the GP is tomorrow. If you want to see the GP reaction, you will have to tune back in for tomorrow. As for now, I will start from the back of the grid and work my way up like normal. And we will start off with Logan Sargent, who did not start the race because he hit the wall during the sprint qualifying, which then they did not have time to get that vehicle put back together for him to actually start the race. We have Yuki Tsunoda that qualified 16th, ended up 19th because he hit the wall. It looked fairly strange at the time, and because he was coming in from a long straight and looks like he just understeered into the corner and just hit the wall and took off that right rear tire. But on further investigation, it looked like his teammate actually had taken out his part of his front wing, and so Yuki did not know that at the time, and so he was trying to brake and just ended up understeering into that. So it wasn't necessarily all of Yuki's fault for that issue that he ended up crashing on. Ocon started from the pits and then had issues with his tires and ended up having a couple of pit stops just trying to get some information for that Alpine. Pretty bad race for those Alpines all weekend, trying to get those new parts and get some data for those. Did not really work out for Ocon. So we will see what he can do tomorrow in the full GP race. Lando Norris is another one of these that started off really good, qualifying 10th and ended up in the back of the grid in 17th. He started off on the softs, one of the few people that started off on softs, and that softs just wore through fairly quickly where he had to pit for those mediums that sent him back to the back of the grid. Even with that virtual safety car that turned into a safety car, he could not really make anything up from that area. So not a super issue with Norris, except for just a strategy for that soft tire, I think. So we'll see if he can do any better in the race tomorrow. Valtteri, qualifying 15th, dropping back a little position, kind of stayed out of the limelight for most of this race. He's another one of those that started off on softs, gained a position, but then ended up dropping back on those softs after they were wearing faster than what they were expecting to. Nico qualified 12th, was actually making his way up into the grid ahead of his teammate. And then he was having some issues with that Haas that basically sent him back into the back of the grid, just slowing down that vehicle faster than he could actually, keep up with. So kind of a bad situation for Nico. Hopefully that'll be worked out in the race tomorrow. Nick DeVries in that AlphaTauri had a horrible first start of this issues, crashing, and in those practice session and qualifying was able to get that vehicle up and running, so it's good to see him getting some actually laps in, kind of making his way up a little bit, mainly because of the people that are dropping back behind him, but still making up a couple of positions. And he did have that issue with his teammate, so it doesn't look real great for Nick DeVries, but he's still getting some lap time in on the circuit, getting back into the rhythm of things, so hopefully he can do better tomorrow. Pierre Gasly was another one of these that started off the back of the grid and worked his way up. I don't have a lot for him. He did fairly good job in passing in that midfield into that section, doing a good job for that Alpine, getting some laps in, getting some data for them. Juan Yuzhou started 14th and basically ended up 12th. Kind of a normal race for him, getting ahead of his teammate, so that's really good in that regard to that Alfa Romeo. Kevin Magnussen started out 13th, worked his way up, ended up passing his teammate and doing a fairly good job, but not quite into the point range in 11th. The top 10, we have Oscar Piastri doing a really good job over Norris in this situation, qualifying 11th and ended up 10th, whereas Norris had qualified 10th, then dropped back into the field because of those soft tires. Oscar was able to maintain that pace on those mediums and kind of almost work his way into the point situation. Really good to see that McLaren and those upgrades to see if they can actually do anything in the longer race tomorrow. But basically staying out of trouble during the sprint. Alex Albon qualified 7th and ended up 9th. He was doing fairly good on that Williams and just couldn't have the pace to really stay up there near the points. Lance Stroll, not quite as good as his teammate Alonso, but was staying fairly close to them and actually passing Albon in the last few laps to get that last point in the sprint race. So that's a good job for Lance. He did have a couple passes later in the race that really pushed him into that spot. So that was really good to see. Lewis Hamilton qualified 6th, dropped to 7th. At one point, he had got up there a little bit, but then Alonso was able to take him out and switch those positions around and push Lewis back behind him in that situation. Pretty good race for Alonso in that regard. Really doing that wily Alonso thing and keeping, those positions where they are. So Alonso really did good. He actually gained a spot on the very first of the race, and then he caught Hamilton on the restart of the race, which pushed him up to 6th. So good job for Alonso, even though that Aston Martin doesn't seem to be really quite dialed in for this race. So hopefully it doesn't hurt them too much tomorrow in the longer running. Carlos Sainz struggled all weekend, but qualified 5th, ended up 5th, staying out of trouble, staying where he was. Then we have George Russell that qualified 4th and ended up 4th, and had a little bit of controversy with that pass on the first lap on Max, kind of touching and tapping Max, and almost kind of pushing him a little bit. In the end, we saw the hole in Max's side pod at the time. I mean, I was looking at the race, and I could say that I think it was a racing incident, especially on the first lap where they're a little bit more lenient on things. I think they were side by side. Good racing incident. I know Max is kind of frustrated, and I could see that because he's, the champion, trying to stave off any kind of point issues or crashes that would push him out of the points more drastically. So he's a little more conservative, I think, in this regard, and was just getting frustrated with George, really being more aggressive because George doesn't have anything much to lose in this situation where Max has most of the points to lose. We have Charles Leclerc that actually qualified first, knocking Sergio Perez out of that pole position, and was able to maintain that actually on the start of the race and the restart of the race. But as that sprint race was going on, that DRS from Perez just overtook Charles on that long straightaway. And when he kind of kept up with him for most of the race, trying to stay in that DRS, which helped him keep Max behind, especially with that damage that Max had, but was not really able to really put any kind of pressure on Perez throughout this race. But a decent show running for that Ferrari, and hopefully that just shows a little bit of what they can do the rest of the season, that they're not completely out of this competition for that, the top end of this race this season. So, and then we have Perez, of course, just getting nicked on that pole position, was able to come back and get that first position, gaining those points back on his teammate, trying to claw back into that champion position with his team. So that was a good job from Sergio. And with that, generally, I thought the sprint was a little bit more dull than I was expecting it to be. And I don't know if that was just because of how things were laid out because of the street circuit. I'll have to see how this works on an actual circuit versus street circuit, as people maybe were a little bit more cautious on some of those front runnings. I was expecting a little bit more pass attempts in that first 8 positions than I actually did see. But it does still better than probably watching a practice session in general for the fans. And I did like the fact that there's only one practice session for the weekend, as that kind of did some change ups for the teams that kind of didn't quite get dialed in, even though the top teams seem to have it pretty well off. So we will see how this progresses in the next race weekend for that sprint, and see if my opinion gets solidified or if it changes somewhat. But for the driver standing, you can see like basically the bottom half of the field were stagnant because of this. There's no really points in that regard, so there was no little jump outs from that bottom half that got points. Basically saw changes in that midfield, and then the top half toward the top 4 or 5 positions stayed the same in the driver's standing. So basically you have George gaining a position from Lance, and Charles, actually because of his poor start this season, gaining positions on Lando, and Nico dropping back to 10th. So pretty low changeover. Just some, Alonso and Hamilton, gap shrinking a little bit, with Charles Leclerc kind of getting back more into that point range. The constructions or the structure standings is basically the same thing. The order stayed the exact same as it was before. You just have a little bit of a tightening of the field between the Mercedes and the Aston Martins. And then you have Ferrari, holding down that 4th position from McLaren. So not too much to say on the constructor standings. We will see if things change anymore during the big race tomorrow. But overall, that was my reactions for this sprint. Hopefully we see a little bit more action in the real race over that, with just that virtual safety car that turned into a safety car because of Yuki. Didn't really change up the strategy because there wasn't a whole lot of strategy that could happen because of the shortness of that sprint race. We may see a little more strategy coming into the realm of the big race, as I'm bound to have some kind of contact that brings out at least a safety car, if not a full safety car. So until then, I will see you on the grid. And if you like this so far, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see my reactions for the big race tomorrow, be sure to subscribe so that you can have those pop up in your list. Thank you so much, and see you on the grid.